Good to see you. Welcome to our last, sadly enough, Meet the Masters project of the year. But this time we are studying Edgar Degas, who is a famous French Impressionist painter. He is known for his ballet dancers. So if you've ever seen paintings of ballet dancers, he probably did it. He made them famous. He did tons and tons of them and was very good at them. And we'll look at a few of them. He did drawings, paintings, sculptures, very well trained, loved to paint, did it his whole life. He did not paint much outside. He enjoyed painting in his studio. So he'd spend a lot of time, out observing and drawing, but then he always painted back at the studio. Painting outside was really popular at this time, but he wasn't really interested in that. So Edgar was the oldest of 5 children. Grew up in France, and his mother died actually when he was 13. And so different influences in his life were very important, such as his father, who loved art and took him to museums at a very young age. And Edgar actually went to high school at 11 years old, a little different back then. And he studied drawing there and started a really good art education. So after high school, he actually went to law school for a little while. He thought that would be a good profession, but he didn't last long. He knew that he loved art, and that's what he wanted to do. And so he dropped out and went to the Paris School of Fine Arts. And there he had really good teachers. They encouraged him to practice drawing. Drawing is that fundamental skill that always carries through all sorts of art, teaching you how to see things and get them onto paper. So he had very good training. His teachers encouraged him also to copy the old masters. So from hundreds of years before, his old paintings that he would go visit and he had seen growing up in museums, one of the best ways to learn to draw is to copy these old masters. So he spent lots and lots of time in museums copying these old paintings, and that was very good training. After he finished at the School of Fine Arts, he went to Italy to continue his study of the masters. And he also had family there. And so it was a great chance for him to visit, and he became associated with other artists. There were lots of young artists there who were less interested in painting in museums like he had been trained to do, and they were more interested in painting everyday scenes. So let's look at this painting. This is one of his earlier, more famous paintings, and it's called Roman Beggar Woman. And this is what a lot of the artists in Italy were doing. These young artists were just outside. And so they weren't painting things from the past. They weren't copying other people. They found beauty in the everyday life. And here is a really powerful picture, I think. You can see there's so much depth to her character and the way that he painted her. Another painting from this time period, early in his career after he had graduated, is called the Bellelli family, and this is actually his aunt's family, and this is who he had also gone to visit. And a really interesting portrait with kind of different poses, and this was much different than what traditional portraits were at the time, where you have people looking in different directions. They're not perfectly posed. You kind of get a scene of where they lived, and I find it really neat. After Degas was in Italy for a while, he moved back to Paris, moved back to France. He became friends with a very well-known painter named Manet, who was an Impressionist painter. And if you remember the term Impressionist, we've talked about this a little bit before, and these are painters who wanted to capture an impression of a scene. So kind of just a quick glimpse or a little snapshot of what things looked like, but not necessarily in a perfectly photo accurate way. They were looking for an impression, so they would go to capture the colors and the feeling. And they always, painted very fast and usually outside. They're trying to capture the light as it hit a certain thing, and really a neat thing. But Degas, as I mentioned before, Degas did not like this necessarily. He didn't like painting outside. He liked painting in the studio, and he hated the term impressionist, because a lot of people considered him an impressionist painter. I might have even said that at the beginning. And there, obviously, you see some of the influence of Impressionism in his work, even though he really felt like he did the opposite of what the Impressionists were trying to do, in that nothing he did, he felt like, was spontaneous. He thought everything out very methodically, thoroughly, and was slow. He spent lots of time drawing and working out the exact forms and shapes that he wanted, instead of just showing up and, not randomly, but quickly capturing a scene. And so, but he was still friends with a lot of these people who were painting in this style at the time. And a couple of things that worked really well for him, especially what he learned from Manet, was that he had encouraged him to stop copying the old masters. There was so much beauty around. Manet encouraged him to paint the world that he saw. And so one of his Degas' favorite things to paint were racehorses. And believe it or not, Degas was one of the first people to capture horse racing in paintings. This was not a typical subject that painters tried to tackle, but Degas was really good at it because he had the ability to quickly sketch and work out a cool scene that he wanted to paint. And then he would go back to his studio and paint that and finish it out. And it was really a really beautiful series that he did. And it gave people an idea of horse racing and popularized it at the time. Let's look at a few more paintings. This one is one of many. In fact, one of maybe 1,500 paintings and drawings that he did over the course of his life of dancers. He became very interested in the ballet and in different dancers, and they were very popular even when he was alive. Apparently, he couldn't paint enough of these kinds of paintings, and people just loved them, and he would just paint and sell them right away. And this became an endless source of inspiration for him. And what's interesting is I love so many of these because he gives us a sense of what it's really like. It's almost like we're kind of getting a behind-the-scenes look. It's not necessarily here's the perfect pose, here is the great, star dancer, perfectly, lines and everything. No, what we're seeing here is kind of that behind the scenes. We see how the dancers are yawning. We see how they're a little tired. We see sometimes they're stretching. We see some of the men over on the side who are kind of bored. They're waiting, for something else to happen. And we have the ballet master standing there and everybody kind of gathered around. We have some really interesting movements and lines that you wouldn't normally see. And he's the one who paid attention to these scenes. One of my favorite is a picture of the orchestra musicians. And here we have a very interesting cropping, right? Where certain parts of the painting almost look as if they're cut off. Degas did this all the time. And you get kind of this really interesting combination of the orchestra musicians, playing away and almost in a completely different world, even though they're working together, the dancers and the musicians. They're really in different worlds, a big contrast between these. And so it's an interesting painting, that a different angle that you might not normally see from an artist. And it's commonly believed that his interest in photography, which was becoming popular at this time, helped him to see things differently. As he became used to starting to take pictures and capture things, he would understand how to get different angles and crop different views. And so really some spectacular paintings and interesting views, and he really puts us into the scenes. As I mentioned, he worked throughout his life, but later on his eyesight began failing. And this is unfortunate, and he wanted to keep drawing, and painting, but he couldn't very well. And so one of the things that he did is he moved towards sculpture, where he could still work with his hands. He could work out the shapes. And I'll show you his most famous sculpture. And he did quite a series of these, but his most famous one is called Little Dancer. And really an interesting little piece, some beautiful lines to it, really neat shapes. And what's unusual is how there's actually some hair and clothing that he's put on the sculpture. Usually you don't see that. It can look kind of weird sometimes, but he did it really well, I think. And so I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the beautiful work that Edgar Degas did. And so enjoy your project, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks.